Ladies and gentlemen, my name's Paul, and in this RedGamingTech.com video, it's happening. That's right, we have results of the Ryzen 5000 series, and it's really bad news for Intel, because if these results are indicative of multiple games, AMD have quite easily surpassed what even the 10900K is capable of. And worse still, this is only with the 5800X. So I hope you are having an amazing day, because I have a feeling that if you're really happy and eager for new processor hardware, then this may make it even better. So these results have been found by Tim Apisek on Twitter, as well as another chap. I'm possibly going to butcher the pronunciation, but Harikaze. I will, of course, link both of their results in the description. So these results are for the 5800X, which is an 8-core 16-thread processor. There are two small negatives with these results. Negative one is that the benchmarks were performed with an RTX 2080. This is not a slow card by any means. However, compared to, let's say, I don't know, a 2080 Ti or a 3080, obviously it's not quite up there. The second negative is that we don't have confirmation on clock frequencies or anything like that of these CPUs. It is an 8-core processor, so we can presume that it is just results of a single CCX on the chip. As we know, they're unified. We'll get to that in just a second. But I would suggest, too, ignoring the score. Let's take Tim's for a second. Crazy underscore 4K. Um, so it's 5,800 points. Now, that is actually slower if you compare that against the 10900K. It's actually, well, not as fast. So you're like, well, that sucks. But instead, what you need to take into consideration are the CPU results. And the CPU results are important because it completely removes the GPU from the equation, and also the results here at 4K. There are some results at 1080p, and we will examine those in a moment, but the average batches for the 5800, excuse me, are 133.6. This is compared to 114.8. Now, of course, with the 10900K, you can overclock, different configurations and all of that stuff, but we don't as well know what the configuration is fully for the 5800X. So, is it overclocked? Is it running at stock? What about memory and timings and like a trillion other things? Like, all of this stuff comes into play, and unfortunately, all we have is as an answer. Moving on, however, to normal batches, the CPU frame rate is 136.3 for the 10900K, but AMD's processor scores 166.6. So let's just round that up and say 30 FPS additional for the I keep calling it the 3700X, for the 5800X, which is again extremely impressive indeed. Now switching to Harikaze's, these results were taken at 1080p. Again, these are the crazy preset, but it does have the benefit of reducing the load, of course, on the GPU. Like the previous results, they are still being taken with the RTX 2080, but here AMD are actually behind in terms of the crazy result. So we have 7,000 versus 7,600. But of course, we don't care about that. What we care about are the CPU results, the frame rate of the CPU, and AMD are ahead with 142.4 versus 125.7, so about 17 FPS difference. And in normal batches, we have 146 versus 169, nice, 0.4. So that's obviously quite a large gap from AMD versus Nvidia. AMD versus Intel. Intel are definitely starting to lose here. And what makes this particularly interesting is that the 10900K is what this is being compared against. And obviously, not everyone is running a 10900K. Like, even if we take Intel's 10th generation processors out of the equation, you can make a very good argument that if you're gaming on like a 9900K, you're still going to be good for a long ass time. It's not like the 9900K is suddenly going to become a bad processor. The same thing, to be honest with you, with like a 3700X or a 3900. But I think this does go to show you the huge ramifications of the architectural changes that we've seen. Just yesterday, I covered a story that it seems like AMD will be hitting 5 gigahertz for at least some of the Ryzen 5000 SKUs. As I covered in that video, realistically, there's not that much of a difference between the engineering samples that we saw at 4.9 gigahertz and 5 gigahertz in terms of actual performance. Like, it's going to be negligible, it's almost going to be margin of error. However, from a PR standpoint, it's obviously huge. But if you take that clock frequency, so we're saying 3 or 400 megahertz, depending on the SKU of the 3000 series versus the 5000 series, and then you compound that just by sheer IPC gains, I think the results speak for themselves. They're going to be tangible. Just a quick refresher, we're looking at about a 15% gain in integer performance. I have seen documentation myself, actually a couple of pieces of documentation, which does seem authentic and internal from AMD, which does seem to boast this, and AMD themselves are touting single core performance advantages. Admittedly, this is not really for the desktop in some of the documentation. Some of it is for server, aka Milan, but still, it's not like single thread performance doesn't translate extremely well to the desktop, in particular for games. The only concern I have at this point was that um, the TDP for these CPUs allegedly is 150 watts, so I do wonder about motherboard compatibility, and also just heat, I guess, and that type of thing. Um, but well, I guess the other concern I do have is what about pricing? As I'll be curious if AMD continues to be extremely aggressive with the pricing for the equivalent of like the 5700 or 5800 CPUs. I don't know if they have to be in terms of gaming performance because the thing is, they are now going to be ahead in pretty much every benchmark. It's very difficult for me to imagine any scenario, assuming again that A, these results are accurate, because at the end of the day, they could be fake. I highly doubt it, but it could be fake. And B, if these results translate to other games, so for example, Doom Eternal or Counter Strike, because obviously CS has been notoriously heavy on um, Intel side. So whether that will be enough to make up the gap, I don't know. But if we are looking at a close match, say let's say that these results are not as good for other games. Let's just use worst case scenario just for a second and say that they're not as good for other games. And let's say that in Counter-Strike Intel still has a small frame advantage and in other games that Intel still does have a very small frame rate advantage. But the fact is, you're probably only going to notice that if you're running like an RTX 3080 on a 1440p monitor and not cranking everything to the max or the equivalent AMD GPU. And the reality is, I don't think that's going to be enough. That's not to say again that the 10900K is a bad processor. I've pretty much owned it since launch because Intel provided it to me and I'm using it as my primary benchmarking rig now and it's been really good. Stable as hell for me, no issues. Even heat, to be honest, is pretty manageable. So it's not like the processor is bad. It's just that with the IPC gains of Zen, combined with the higher clock frequencies, with obviously, so it's a new architecture with higher clock frequencies, yeah, Skylake can only do so much. Rocket Lake will have to wait and see. It's always possible that Rocket Lake could be surprising. I'm hearing mixed things here, but damn, I mean, that's a profound performance increase. I'm hoping that we don't get gouged price-wise, and obviously I hope as well that the number of CPUs isn't, very small that's produced. I hope it's not essentially a paper launch. But as always, we can only wait. While we're on the subject of tech stuff, I also want to talk about something that's being Well, rather controversial, and that is the amount of space that is left on the Xbox Series X's SSD when you take into account the OS reserve. So, quick reminder, there's 1 terabyte of space on the Series X console, with the Series S obviously having less at 500 gigabytes. But as always, with any of the more modern consoles, so the PlayStation 3, for example, PS4, Xbox One, blah, 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 a portion of that space is allocated to the operating system because obviously the console needs an OS. And clearly it also doesn't take into account any other applications, not including games that you install, so Netflix and whatever else also takes space too. IGN recently have got a hands-on with the console and they've confirmed that in terms of usable space, so that's the key, not total space, usable space, we only have 802 gigabytes of space, which is obviously not exactly huge. Now, just because of GIB versus GB and the way that manufacturers kind of, let's say, advertise the space on the disk, if you have a 1 terabyte storage expansion, obviously that's being produced from Seagate on the behalf of Microsoft, you're looking at 920 gigabytes. And again, that's pretty typical with how PC hard drives work as well, GIB versus GB. So 802 gigabytes is roughly, when you take that into account, plus the OS reserves themselves, it is roughly, to be honest with you, kind of what I expected. And it's not, well, unusual. Because if you look back at history, there was articles, for example, dating back in 2013 with people complaining about the amount of space on the Xbox One, with people complaining of like about 130, 140 gigabytes, whatever it was used by the OS. And the PlayStation 4 wasn't like it was only sipping at the space either. The PS4, I think, was less. I think it was like 19, 95, something like that, gigabytes of space, which obviously is smaller than what Microsoft's OS reserves were, but it's still not exactly titchy. So the fact that they've got all of this backwards compatibility stuff and all this other crap needing to be stored on the drive is, well, not surprising to me that we're looking at this. There are some reports that the PlayStation 5 actually has a smaller OS footprint, but it seems a bit ambiguous because some are reporting it as it's actually less RAM that's being allocated to the OS, whereas others seem to be interpreting it as it's actually less space on the SSD. It's hard to know which of these two it is. It could definitely be both. But again, you also need to take into consideration that the PS5 SSD is smaller at 825 gigabytes. We've discussed before many times over as to the reason that that is the case. Um, and for some reason, there is still tons of misinformation that the 825 figure is the space that is left after the OS is installed, which is patently false. No console manufacturer in the history of humanity has ever told you the space after the applications are installed. Like, look at your phone, for example. The total space, let's say you've got 32 gigabytes of storage on your phone, it's not before, so it's not after Android or whatever is installed on the phone. That's the total space, bud. Yeah, so if Android takes like 4 gigabytes, I'm just throwing a silly figure out there, and you're left with 12, sorry, you're left with the remainder, I can't remember if I said 16 or 32 now, then that's your problem. Um, so yeah, not to mention the fact it's just how Cerny and his team constructed the PS5 with the 12 NAND chips. Again, I've gone over this rather extensively and how it works on a technical level. It's basic how they achieve such high bandwidth. So there's 12 NAND chips, and these connect to a 4 PCIe lanes, and obviously that creates the ridiculous amount of bandwidth that we're looking at for the PS5. The negative naturally is then we're only left with 825-ish gigabytes of space. I personally think that the PS5, and this is a guess, this is not insider information, I'd be surprised if you have much change over 700-ish gigabytes of space. Um, So it's kind of interesting because, um, I'm gonna shock you here, so you may need to sit down. I suggest you also assume the brace position as a Brit. Um, again, that was probably shocking to you that I'm British. I am quite fortunate in that the ISPs I have access to actually provide essentially unlimited data and are pretty snappy. I'm actually going to be moving soon, and when I move, this new area I'm in actually provides me faster internet options, even though I'm staying with the same ISP. So I can get up to 500 megabytes per second rather than what am I on now, 350 or something like that. So obviously that's pretty damn snappy. And I am very fortunate and very lucky for that because I'm not paying an exorbitant fee and the data caps are basically non-existent unless I really took the piss. Like if I was downloading terabytes of data day in and day out, then the ISP may write me a letter and ask why the hell I'm running an FTP from my house. But in general, they won't really bug you as long as you're sticking within typical usage guidelines. But that's obviously not the case for some regions. So if I'm hearing Australia from Australian friends is not exactly ideal for the internet situation. So yeah, it's going to be interesting to see how all of this space is managed. For the Series S, one good thing is that games don't take up as much storage. Microsoft and developers have basically estimated that there could be up to a 30% less storage space needed, simply because of the fact that you're looking at lower quality textures. Obviously, we don't need the full 4K textures in there, which is definitely a good thing. It's smart that Microsoft have done that. But yeah, I think that the next generation is going to be very interesting. Personally, from the people I know, no one's actually planning to buy storage, whether it's for the PS5 or the Xbox Series X. Obviously, you can plonk an external drive on there, so you could use like an external hard drive and then transfer games over. So that's definitely one way to go, and with backwards compatibility too, you could have, let's say, an Xbox Series X with the Series X games, for example, Medium. You could have that installed locally on your hard drive, sorry, the SSD, the internal SSD, but then you can transfer those games over that are backwards compatibility, focus titles to the external drive, or you can transfer games to get space on the drive if you don't want to download like 50 gigabytes or whatever. Um, yeah, those are realities, unfortunately, in the next gen consoles. Microsoft have confirmed that the 1 terabyte expansion is like $220 US, which is a lot of money, but it's not really more expensive than I anticipated. I mean, PCIe 4 drives on PC are not exactly $2.50, as I've said before. Um, and I suspect it's going to be similar pricing for the PS5. The PS5 does have some advantages in that you don't need to worry about proprietary drives. You can basically use whatever, but it does need to meet certain conditions and requirements. For example, form factor and speed. So the one good thing about that is that maybe prices of the PS5 options will come down faster, or you could possibly get larger capacity drives faster. But then again, you're also on the negative of needing to open your console up because it's an it's an internal storage bay versus the Series X, which is basically you change cartridges like it's a bloody games console. Like it's a bloody handheld console, like it's a Switch. So yeah, it's kind of like um, I don't think I'm talking about from the user like perspective, not performance perspective here. I think both have their pros and cons, and both are kind of expensive. I'm going to be curious how popular actually upgrade solutions are because if you buy like a Series S, for example, yeah, it's like what's the console like 299 in the States? I think it's 299. It's 250 here. So it's going to be interesting for someone mentally to be like, well, gee, I could pick up like an SSD, so expansion, but that's like two-thirds ish the price of the console I just bought. Like, what do I do? Yeah, this console generation is going to be very interesting for the first like year because I think it's going to be a rather large tectonic shift in how people think about storage and space. But with that said, thanks very much for watching the video. Um, just a very quick reminder for those who have missed my last couple of videos or are new viewers. And if you are new, then thanks very much for joining. And if you are a longer term subscriber, then also thanks very much for sticking with us. The next couple of days for me is going to be a little crazy. I will be moving tomorrow. It looks like, unless there's something that really, kind of crazy happens. So I will be moving. There will probably be a video that's up. It might be Amy that produces that Thursday. I don't know what the hell's happening. It depends on the time that my internet gets enabled, to be honest, as allegedly it will be working on Thursday. So yeah, if you want to cross your fingers for me, that would be just great and swell. And then from then, my content schedule should be relatively good. I have several videos that I'm working on. It's just at the moment it's very difficult for me to film and kind of get everything done because I'm just tearing everything down and packing everything up, ready to move. But the new filming location will be much better. And another benefit too is I'll be getting like new camera equipment and kind of like, all of that crap. I've just been reticent to do it in this place because I know I'm going to have to shift everything else within, a couple of weeks. So it's just kind of like getting more stuff with then the potential of that getting broken during a move. It's just, it just wasn't exactly the smartest decision, it seemed to me. But anyway, thanks very much for watching the video. Hopefully you're having a great day, and I'll see you soon. Take care of yourselves. Bye for now.